And hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 251, season 5, episode 38. Yes, there's life after episode 250. I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a wonderful and glorious and incredibly successful and amazing and blessed week. Episode 251 comes your way. The title this week, On Knowing When to Hold and Knowing When to Fold. Yeah, I couldn't avoid it. You'll see why in the course of the conversation today. If you're watching this, then I apologize for the beard. It is growing in white. There's no other way to describe that. It ages me dramatically. I don't think it particularly appealing for the vibe and the look I'm generally trying to speak to and go for. But hey, it is what it is. And the timing is the timing on the Jewish calendar when it is definitely a season of contemplation, a season of mourning as we head into the very heavy period leading into the commemoration and mourning of the destruction of the temple all those years ago, which is just over a week away. Opening question. Let's get this rolling on knowing when to hold and knowing when to fold. What makes a leader trustworthy? Because you have to come up with the words or the description or the picture. What is it that makes a leader trustworthy? You can't just simply say, I find him or her trustworthy. Like, define that, explain that, have me understand what you mean when you say that about a certain person, a certain leader. You can't leave that empty. You can't leave that half-baked. So is it something about their consistency? Is it about their conviction? Is it about their ability to keep their word? Something more subtle, deeper, more essential? Like, what is going on there that we say about a leader that he or she is trustworthy? And in the modern world, it's super hard because most of the leaders probably that we find around us, political leaders certainly, lack that trustworthiness. Or to borrow a term from the now canceled Stephen Colbert, that was just me on a soapbox for a second there. Many years ago, he coined the phrase a truthiness, which actually wasn't a word, but it gave you the sense of a word. Was that there's something truthful about what it was that the person said, even though it wasn't actually truthful. So what is it about the leader? So this week's double portion, actually, as we complete the fourth book of Moses together for the fifth time, the portions known as Matot and Maseh, opens with a section on the laws of vows and then ends with the story of the two tribes, ultimately the 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh, deciding to choose to settle outside of the promised land. And at first, these two stories, I think, very much seem unrelated. But when read together, when we think about them together, the same way that we were able to bridge stories last week, they offer, I think, a profound leadership insight that is often overlooked. That great leadership, here it comes, great leadership isn't just about holding firm. It's about knowing when to hold and knowing when to fold or knowing when to let go. And as Kenny Rogers put it in the song, you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. If you start to sing the song now while you're listening, I totally understand because as I was preparing, Kenny Rogers is playing in my head. So let's dive into this and understand both sides of this, or the two stories here, the vows and the story of the two tribes making this decision and making this determination. So let's talk about the weight of a word. The story begins, or the portion begins, with the idea that if a person makes a vow, he must not break his word. He must do what it is that he said. In the biblical imagination and understanding, words create worlds. And we know this to be true. The Bible opens, God spoke, and the world came into being. So too, in our own worlds, our words shape reality, they shape trust, and they shape the moral order. It's not anything less than what we could call a spiritual bond. We take our words very seriously. Those who pray believe in the power of prayer. It's not just believing in the idea of prayer, but in saying the words. If someone is not well, in saying their name out loud in the course of the prayer, that there is power in those words. It's that spiritual bond. There's a relationship between us and our ability to speak and the words that we say. It's a statement very much of identity. Very often, the words we say is a mirror of our values. It sometimes is a glimpse inside. And I very much believe that it's a commitment to who we believe ourselves to be when it is that we speak, or particularly here, when it is that we take a vow, when we commit to something with words. Now, it's important to appreciate and to realize that the law of vows as taught here in the Bible is actually first taught to the leaders because, as we learned in the 80s, when from E.F. Hutton, when people speak, others listen, right? Those two references already in one episode. Because when leaders speak, others listen. And when leaders break their word, trust erodes, and trust erodes fast. The vows we're speaking about actually here are actually voluntary. A person does not have to take them, but a person chose to accept upon themselves this higher level, elevated level of severity, of commitment, of vow to the words that they say, which makes them not just frivolous words spoken, but binding. And when they're binding, we have to take them very serious. And we can't just simply walk away from them and break them and just throw them away. We have to consider how that works. And so it's appreciated here as well. There's a psychological idea that we've actually talked about before from DC and Ryan, the self-determination theory, that the more self-authored a commitment, the more identity-driven it becomes. So when a person breaks a vow, we're not really just breaking trust, and we're not just simply violating our words. We're very much breaking the alignment with ourselves, because if we consecrated something or sanctified something with words, we put it into that space, we held it high, we made it holy, let's say, or we simply just committed to something, to take it out of the space of vows and to put it into the space of our own life commitments, professional commitments, personal commitments, then we've done something here. We've elevated, and it says something about who we are, and it's very much in alignment or disalignment with who we are as individuals. But here's the truth. Sometimes life changes. Sometimes the reality changes. Sometimes the story that we're living shifts. And so the commitment that perhaps once made a lot of sense might not make sense anymore. So what do we do there? So the Bible gives us an out, right? The Bible gives us the ability to nullify a vow, to decide that what we held firm or committed to before no longer is true. But it doesn't work in every circumstance. It doesn't work in every situation. But it is true that the ability to nullify and to break that commitment is possible. And we can speculate as to why the Bible gives us that ability. We know also from the Talmud and other commentaries that we're recommended, highly recommended, not to take vows and not to make these kinds of commitments, even if we think them or we want to do them, but not to put them in those words because of the severity and the seriousness with which we take our commitments. So we have this idea of commitment. We have this idea of the seriousness to which we take our words. And we also have the ability to nullify and to get out of those vows. That's side one. Side two is the story of the 2.5 tribes, or at least here it's the 2 tribes and ultimately 2.5 tribes who decide to settle on the other side of the river, what you might call in modern terms the East Bank. So at the end, they come to Moses and they say, look, we're not crossing. We've marched with everybody for 40 years. We believe in the dream. We believe in the promised land. We believe that it belongs to us. And yet we decided to live outside the promised land. And it sounds a bit like a betrayal. And Moses seems to lean into that, and he is not happy for a whole host of reasons. But we went into that story a couple of years ago. So what happens here after the rebuke from Moses? They clarify, they renegotiate. They're not abandoning the mission. They're just adapting their part in the mission, in the vision, in the promise, in the dream. And so they promise, they commit, here's that word, they vow, fight, and then to settle. And so their values don't change, but their terms as it relates to the story, in fact, does. So what's going on here? So the fundamental principle that is at play in both of these circumstances, in both of these situations, when to nullify, when to not nullify, when to hold to that commitment, and when to not hold to that commitment, meaning first in terms of vows, second in terms of the 2.5 tribes, because they could have just gone in with everybody else, but they are breaking from it, is the quality known in English as discernment. We're going to explain what that means in just a second. They're adjusting their vow without abandoning their cause. They're honoring their commitment, and they do ultimately honor that commitment, and they do fight and help the people settle the land before they go home and settle themselves. They're simply just doing this differently than the way it was perhaps perceived and expected and understood by everybody else until this point. And that quality of knowing when to hold and knowing when to fold, that space between those things is the space known as the space of discernment. And leadership isn't always about all the time staying the course. Sometimes you have to adapt. Sometimes you have to reevaluate. And sometimes you have to look at it and appreciate that sometimes you have to hold firm and sometimes you have to release when it no longer fits. And I don't think for a second that when that's true, that a person is breaking with their integrity. Because I think at all points, a leader in all these spaces has to rigorously evaluate and reevaluate and reconsider and then maybe recommit to the values and the fundamental ideas to which he or she holds dear. Not every week, certainly not, but this quality of discernment, which I don't think we've talked about in all the weeks and all the years of coaching the Bible, is enormously important. When do we know to keep on the mission and keep going forward and to doing it the way we're doing it? And when do we decide that we got to change gears, we have to shift, we have to use the term, here's another reference, pivot, to pivot to something else? So discernment is very much a leadership superpower. It's the ability to perceive the subtle distinctions that exist and then choose with clarity what to do next. I don't think it's just instinct. I don't think it's just data. It's what I would look at and think of as a very mature and very advanced and very experienced values-based judgment about the circumstance and situation that you find yourself in. Discernment then at its core is about your integrity. It's about your alignment or self-alignment. It's about your ability to judge. Knowing when now to look at a promise, a commitment, a vow, a value set that reflects who you are, and then in circumstances and instances to release it because it no longer does. And it's quiet and it's subtle and we don't celebrate it. And often we don't even realize it because it's not always obvious that it's a choice between a good and a bad. Sometimes it's simply a choice between one good versus another good, or one truth versus another truth. And now one truth of the two has elevated itself and lifted itself up. And now that's the priority. And it's not built on instinct because it goes much deeper. It has to work through your inner being about your values and your past experiences and your EQ and your patterns and your behaviors. And it's not just data because it's a mix of the data with your values. And now I have to mix the two and rework it and refigure it out. And it goes then to not simply just being knowledgeable and smart, but perhaps deeper into a space called wisdom. And discernment then is an applied wisdom that governs when we act, when we wait, when we speak, and when we stay silent. In Hebrew, the term for discernment is havchana, means to distinguish, is to see between and into what is and perhaps what ought to be. And discernment then allows a leader to ask, is this right and not just effective? Is this true and not just popular? Is this mine, actually mine, or is this just inherited? And there are a lot of different types of discernment: moral discernment, strategic discernment, relational discernment, and self-discernment. We can't get into all of that, but it's really fundamental core. And what's really important as a leader is to grow and to learn how to be a more discerning leader, how to know when to say something, how to know when to not say something, how to know when to change that value, to look at your core set and say, this doesn't align with us anymore. But to look at is what you're doing and decide that, you know what, this mission that we're on, this company that we're building no longer works. It's hard. So some aspect of this is moral and deep, and some of this is very practical. And there are a lot of questions that we can ask as leaders to get at the heart of determining of when it is that I have to hold and when it is that I have to fold. Take a look at something that's a hardcore value for you as a person. Here's an example. You're a business person. You're a one-person business. Opportunity comes along for you to partner with somebody, but you're fiercely independent. And you promised yourself that when you went into business, you were always going to be your own boss on your own. And now you look at this opportunity and you have to ask yourself, does that promise still make sense for me in this moment? I know what I said when I said it. I know why I said it when I said it back then, the age of 22, 23, whatever it was. But now, 15, 20, 25, 30 years later, whatever it is, knowing what I know now in this circumstance with this opportunity in front of me, does that promise still hold? Am I going to hold myself back or hold myself to a promise made all those years ago because it meant something then and it no longer means anything now? Or something else that maybe is holding a promise that is serving in some way the work that I'm doing, but really, is it just protecting my ego? Or at the core of who you are as a person, is this commitment, is this promise, is this value, is this vow still aligned with who you are today? And if you decide and determine that you're abandoning it and going in a different direction, that's okay. The question is, how do you do that? And what do you do? And so I'll just give you two practicals: the still true test and the boundary map. The still true test is simply this: write down a belief, a promise, or a value that you have, that you hold, and ask yourself, is this still true? Is it still true? And if it's not, then I would recommend to grieve it, mourn it, reflect upon it, and then give yourself permission to update it with integrity and explain why to yourself and to others. I'll give you the permission to update it with integrity and help you, if you'd like, to explain it to others. But that's the still true test in quotes. The number two idea is this a leadership boundary map. Take your value set. It's not a lot of things, it's a handful of things, 5, 6 things, whatever they may be. And then look at them and say, column 1 or circle 1, draw a circle. These are the non-negotiables. These are the things that have consistently always been true about me as a person, as a leader. That's circle 1. Circle 2 is to look at all the areas where you've matured or you've changed and realize that what you might have thought was an untouchable, immutable, impossible value system, vow, commitment, promise from before is actually something that has evolved over time. So there's the non-negotiables, the immutables, the sacred, the sanctified, and then the evolvables, the things that have moved and shifted and matured over the course of time. In the space of doing such a thing, one realizes that their ability to discern, to make these decisions, to change, to evolve, to adapt is part and parcel of who they are as a person, and very much part and parcel of who they are as a leader. Closing it out, in the end, we appreciate that leadership is not about never wavering. It's about knowing the difference between what's sacred and what's stuck, between a promise you must keep and one that no longer reflects who you are. And discernment is what lets you tell the difference with clarity, with honesty, with courage, and with that quiet conviction that you will keep on leading even as you evolve as that leader. To close it out with a quote, is a quote from Robert Burney: discernment is having the eyes to see and the ears to hear and the ability to feel the emotional energy that is truth. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. Look forward to seeing you next week. Wishing you and blessing you with a glorious and incredibly amazing and successful and happy and joyous weekend.